So hello, everyone. Welcome to the second year of Beyond the Web Salon Series. I'm Angie Raymond, the Director of Data Management Information Governance here at the Ostrom Workshop. The Ostrom Workshop formally began as the Center in Political Theory and Policy Analysis, founded, of course, at Indiana University in 1973 by Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom and her husband, Vincent Ostrom. The Ostroms believe that the ideas and theories must be considered through the lens of experience, that the critical connection is between ideas and what's get done. Hence, why we're doing today this Salon Series. Today's Salon Series is brought to you by the Program on Data Management Information Governance. The Data Governance Program seeks to address issues associated with data management and information governance through the exploration and creation of multidisciplinary structures, policies, procedures, processes, and control implementation to manage data information. Beyond the Web series is hosted by Doc Searles, an American journalist, columnist, and widely read blogger. Of course, you're more than passingly familiar with what is one of my favorite books, The Clue Train Manifesto. I'm now going to turn it over to Doc to begin today's Salon Series, and thank you ahead of time for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, Angie. A few words about the Beyond the Web theme. Marshall McLuhan said, or is said to have said, that we shape our tools and our tools shape us. Those of us that are 28 so far that are looking at this on the web, you're being shaped by that. And you're doing it on Zoom, and Zoom sets the rules, and we live with those things. But there's a subordination involved in that of us to systems. And trying to get a community going is a really interesting part of that when we're living in a kind of feudal system that's ruled by Apple and Google and Amazon and Adobe and a bunch of other companies. And also, I've been working, and Joyce was in the room, and many people on this call as well, on something called Project VRM, which we started at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard in 2006. There are many communities within that, and we've tried to get a lot of things going. And it's kind of, all of our ideas have been about world-changing ideas, and it's kind of hard to boil that ocean. So we're here in Indiana, and Joyce and I are visiting scholars here at the Ostrom Workshop, starting a project called the Byway, in the same way that some of you old enough to remember when the internet first came along, all the coverage of it was about the information superhighway. That's what they called it, like covers of dozens and dozens of magazines about the information superhighway. We have it now, and the lanes are called Apple and Google and Facebook and the rest of them. So we want to make something happen here in Bloomington that's local, and we're calling it the Byway. And how is that going to be governed? And that's a big question for us. How is it self-governed? And nobody knows more about this than Nathan Schneider, who's with us here. Nathan's a professor at the University of Colorado. He deals in media studies and many other things, but he's probably, to me at least, the world's leading authority on community governance and how all this happens. And there's a great deal of research going on about this as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Nathan. Say what you like, man.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here, both with you, someone whose work I've been following for years, and here at the Ostrom Workshop, which is a kind of spiritual home for many of us interested in the study of self-governance. And so it is just thrilling to be here. I'll just draw a couple threads and see where they take you. For me, this work on online governance is a kind of circular one. I come to it through spending about the last decade working with people trying to build cooperative businesses in online space. Trying to address the challenge you posed around the monopoly power of big corporate platforms and so forth by building cooperative alternatives. Lots of cooperative attempts to do ride sharing, to do social media, to do gig platforms, all this sort of thing. And in that work over and over, I've seen constraints. in trying to build something against the grain, you see how the wood runs, you know, and so part of that has been around financing and policy and that sort of stuff. But I also started noticing something around something a little smaller scale, a little more intimate to our online lives, which is the designs of what I call, for the lack of a better term, spaces. You know, the spaces of online life, the minute interactions. And I'll give you an example. So for a while in this work on cooperative development, I was running a 500-person email list. And as happens on the internet, there were some issues with someone who was perceived by most people, or by many people on the list, as a kind of troll, as a kind of disruptor, right? And so I, as the moderator, had to figure out what to do about this. Now, this is a list full of people who are obsessed with democratic organizing, right? And it became very clear to me, like, I had no idea how to make this decision democratically. And what's more, I couldn't figure out how to get to a point where I would know how to. And that every time I looked at what does the admin interface for me look like, nothing there helped me get to that point. And meanwhile, I was, you know, I was having conversations with my mother, as I love to do, and she was telling me about this garden club in her neighborhood that she had just been elected president of. Very Ostromite institution, kind of Tocquevillian as well, you know, this classic, you know, American kind of suburban civic association. And I was kind of blown away as she described the processes that she was going through in this garden club. She got elected, there were bylaws, there were things that constrained her power, there were processes for change. And it just struck me how unable I felt to implement some of those basic practices that people have been doing for a very long time offline in online space. And so that really spurred me along in thinking about how did this happen? What kinds of constraints are built in that make it hard to do democracy online? And that took me back into a historical process of trying to understand how did some of these norms emerge about admins and mods and
which predate the internet as we know it now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. You know, it took me back into BBS land, right? Right. Bulletin board services, where I mean, these incredible documents and stories where people are, you know, can hear that they're running an online community out off a computer in their house that they built themselves, and that they can hear the whirring of the hard drive based on the pitch of the whir. Right. They can tell which, you know, who's doing what, or at least what part of the hard drive is being accessed, you know, because it was just, and that sense is that the people in that community were guests in their house. And because they were all on that server, that person was the host, and
so the physicality of the server was a big part of this thing.
Absolutely. And you saw this as things get more sophisticated, like Lambda Moo. There's a classic old from the early 90s, a story from the Village Voice called A Rape in Cyberspace, right? About kind of early conflict on an early all text-based social network called Lambda Moo. And there's a conflict, and a user who is sexually assaulting virtually people in that space, and the community tries to figure out what to do about this. And they develop some kind of democratic rulemaking procedures. And then actually the people who are running the servers at Xerox PARC realize, you know what, actually we're legally liable for what happens here. And the server is on our property. So actually we can't let you do that. We can't let you do that, democracy.
Right?
And so you see these patterns in which like people did experiment with democratic practices like that garden club, but certain technical constraints and legal constraints intervened and said, oh, maybe don't do that. And so it drove the development toward reinforcing what I came to call maybe a little too grandiose term, implicit feudalism, sense that there is a feudalism, not here talking about that economic feudalism you were talking about earlier, but like a kind of more community level,
lords and serfs. There are lords and serfs here.
Yeah. And that it's implicit in that I can enter into a mailing list or a Facebook group or a group chat, on WhatsApp or something. And I can say, I love democracy. I love self-governance and all the Austrian principles. I've studied them really hard. But actually, there's this implicit structuring of the tools. That prevent me or make it at least harder than it otherwise might be to try to enact those practices. So when we map the legacy of self-governance of the Austrian tradition into online space, I think what you find is that a lot of these design principles are actually quite hard to implement because of certain patterns that have developed over time.
So a couple of thoughts about that. One is, we've been in the physical world. We've had gardens for thousands of years, right? And in the physical world, we have gestures, we have language, we have three-dimensional environments that are very familiar to us at a tacit level. I mean, we need no explanation. The online world is entirely made of explicits. It's ones and zeros, it's programmatic, and it's two-dimensional as well. And so a couple things about that. One is, are we forever constrained by that? And the other is it actually just very, very early right now? I mean, we've had the internet in the commercial form since April 30th of 1995, when the NSFNet shut down with its policy forbidding commercial activity. Really, Amazon exploded immediately after that, and eBay immediately, but that's when we had the world we have now. It's not very long, it's 27 years. In the history of business, much less civilization, is not that long. So I just wonder your thoughts about that and what you can't take them away. There are no takeaways here yet. They're just things we can apply, right? Have you come up with so far?
So I think it's instructive to look then at the development of blockchain technologies in relationship to that story you're talking about, to that time frame, because this is a set of tools and contexts where there's a different dynamic. And I don't want to, glamorize or valorize the technology in any sort of intrinsic way. A lot of evil gets done on these things. But there is also a sense in which it does actually challenge the very technical paradigm, at least, that reinforced implicit feudalism in the previous regime. And that is because the networks, the protocols, and then the nodes, say a DAO on top of Ethereum.
A distributed autonomous organization.
That's right. So a group of people sharing something together, doing something together, tends to have kind of co-governance, or at least some kind of co-ownership with some governance rights as a kind of default setting. And of course, that default gets turned into a kind of new top-down autocratic stuff. But there is actually the issue that was an issue with Lambda Mu, where ultimately it's all sitting at Xerox PARC server, is actually not a problem with the blockchain, because before it's at Xerox PARC, it's actually on the distributed network. And in that context, we've been looking at about, a little bit over a decade of development, a lot of it solving basic problems. But really in the last few years, you see actually an explosion of innovation in governance tools that you don't see. And so you see new voting mechanisms, you see new interfaces, you see people just all the time building and building and building. So there are multiple competing governance tool sets and stacks that you can build into your DAO. And none of that was happening in the previous regime. So that to me suggests that there was a real constraint. It wasn't just a matter of, oh, we haven't gotten there yet. It was that the tech and legal stack of Web 1 and 2 actively prevented this innovation. And as soon as we got onto a stack that had some different structure to it, suddenly the question, the tooling and the need for innovation and creativity and building and tooling around self-governance starts to explode.
So is it fair to say then that there is this giant new exploding frontier of possibilities online that we did not have offline? And then maybe also that what we did with the web, with client server, for example, was just repeating some familiar stuff that we had in the physical world.
It was actually constraining. Like, again, it wasn't, I kept asking myself, what would it take for my mailing list to catch up to my mother's garden club?
Yeah. Okay.
But then there are differences, right? In that, for instance, online life, exit is much easier than an offline life. There are certain components of online life that require things where it's not just, you don't just want to replicate the garden club, because the garden club is predicated on you live in this neighborhood, you bought a house there or whatever, you're bought in. Whereas online spaces, for instance, there's a kind of meme in the crypto world of rage quit, which is the kind of glamorized exit. Exit is much easier. That changes dynamics, among other things.
Yeah. So we should open this to questions if anybody has any here. I'm looking for online to see if any hands are up. None so far. Over here. It's hard to see you against the light and the backlight, but go ahead, sure.
I think I'm interested in learning about the legal constraint that you're kind of alluding to, because like over the past few years, we have Section 230, right? We have the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. We also do not have like a comprehensive federal privacy or cybersecurity regulation. And that means that there's practically, I wouldn't say no regulation, but there's limited like regulation. What's happening now is like a general kind of involvement into what's happening. Like we have these private companies that governs these platforms. So my question is, so what kind of constraint are you kind of tackling here?
In terms of policy?
Yeah.
So I think, Section 230 is interesting. I think it's useful to read policy regimes in light of these logics, right? So Section 230, when you start seeing the kind of pattern of implicit feudalism, right? It's not just a blank check. And you see this explicitly in the design among the senators who designed it. They'll articulate their rationale this way: is we wanted to provoke companies to innovate on governance, right? On moderation, on management. And so we gave them free space to do that. And because of the stack of Web 2, Web 1 technologies, it really did the power and defaults to the company. So one concept that I think of a lot in terms of this stuff is where are the power vacuums? Okay, an example of this, for instance, is the software stack of Git. The most popular tool for software collaboration. It doesn't really have an admin concept, but then the power defaults to wherever Git resides. So on GitHub, then it adopts GitHub's admin structure. So often what happens in these cases, and Section 230 is a great example of this, is it's kind of like, you all figure out what your power structure is. Like, it doesn't define, how accountability flows, but the default, then it rests on a structure that says ultimately the corporation is responsible for what's going on there. And so it emboldens that sense of, what Kate Klonick calls the new governors, platform companies as essentially proxy regulators. And you see this also in China, for instance, where, we imagine this kind of government draconian structure sometimes in the kind of paranoid fantasies of the US imagination. But it's also, what's really going on there is the companies don't necessarily have a great deal of visibility into what the government does or doesn't want. They are encouraged to regulate as they see fit with some kind of expectation of what the next level structure wants. So one thing I'm interested in is could we shift this power dynamic? Could we, the language I use here is governable spaces. Can we use governable spaces as a policy tool, as a policy concept for solving policy problems, rather than assuming we want you, the company, to fix our problems for us? Instead, to recognize, okay, we have a problem with moderation. Could enabling community self-governance actually help us solve that problem better than relying on the top-down power of a company? So, one thing I've been exploring in very kind of, rough form is, could we rethink something like Section 230 to say, okay, you get immunity if you actually enable healthy democratic practice, so that companies then, have a kind of out. And they're actually looking for this. I mean, like Facebook is externalizing moderation to its oversight board. A bunch of companies are starting to figure out that actually, Jack Dorsey just said after leaving Twitter, it never should have been a company. He's been trying to create an open protocol to replace the company Twitter. He doesn't want these moderation decisions. And, maybe policy could support that desire to externalize these decisions through encouraging democratic practice in, daily online life. So I think there's some interesting opportunities for policy there. I think it gets messy, but this is a conversation I hope we could start to have. How can we replace the logic of top-down regulation with a logic of community self-governance?
So quickly, Angie, if you can, or somebody can, put the chat up here. We have a lot happening in the chat. Questions about the DAO, can the DAO inform co-ops being started as corporations? Somebody wants for Muggles among us to explain what Section 230 is.
Oh, yeah.
There's another one I'd like to know what you imagine as the tipping point for the growth of uptaking in the innovation around self-governed companies and value chains. Are we waiting for the perfect DAO, or how do we get more buy-in for applications of more sustainable and equitable businesses, for example? So there are those, and then we now have two hands that are up, including Rashida. I think it was Rashida's one I just read, I think, but anyway, and Adrian's hand is up. But
well, a couple of those. So Section 230, like the surviving component of the Communication Decency Act in 1986, that essentially creates a safe harbor so that platform companies are not responsible for most user-generated content. They're not liable for most user-generated content on their platforms. That responsibility goes to users, and it gives essentially a green light to online platforms to publish and share user content that they don't first approve. So it is the law that enables the whole platform economy, and it's a really important thing. It's also been very controversial. Both Trump and Biden, have said that they don't like it, but I think there's also a sense in which it's a little too big to fail, and it's a really important kind of background infrastructure of the online economy. In terms of enabling more ownership and governance stuff, it's in some respects a parallel conversation, and something that, happy to get into or not, but I think it's ultimately really important, because I don't think we ultimately get collective governance unless we have collective ownership of some sort, or something analogous to collective ownership. And I think it's, in my years working with co-ops, it's become very clear to me how hard that is in almost every industry in the United States and most parts of the world. Largely, I think, because of capital regulation, that it is just very, very hard to raise capital to build collectively owned businesses at anything like the scale that investor-owned businesses can reach. And so I think we have a major challenge that is my other kind of main current of work right now, to try to figure out how to address those policy gaps and to make sure that shared ownership is as available as investor ownership, at least.
We have 4 questions in the queue, and I also know that there are people here. I see Carolina's here, an old colleague from Berkman. Hi, who are involved in creating these groups as well, and I'm wondering what's resonating with them. We'll start with Adrian, who's had his hand up the longest, I think.
Hi. The leap between governance and regulation seems to me to skip over professions as an alternate and very prominent and well-established method of regulation that's completely separate from the corporate model. And I'm curious in your work, or in what your thinking is, because it's so easy to jump directly to Web3 and DAOs and peer-to-peer models and pretend that we know what decentralization means, and try to then layer these very innovative, and I agree, DAO models and social models onto this peer-to-peer model, when in reality, we're ignoring a century or centuries of professional regulation as anything but peer-to-peer or corporate.
Thank you for that. And I have a paper on how we have no idea what decentralization means. So I'm with you on that. I guess I have a little less faith in the capacity of professional associations to go against the economic grain, which isn't to mean I ignore them. I mean, in the book I'm working on, for instance, on this stuff, design is a major pillar. The logic of design and design ethics and standards. And these are the kinds of things that professional associations can often be involved in upholding and reinforcing. And so I think there is space for that. And for instance, in our research network, a bunch of that has been really fueling this work for me, called the Meta Governance Project. We just, for instance, released a document that came out of our time at the Internet Archive's DWeb Camp on kind of not quite principles, but kind of things to think about for the design of governance interfaces. So in that sense, we're also developing standards for DAO design, working with all the major DAO kind of tooling organizations to help guide their governance structuring. So I absolutely think that is a point of intervention. However, I think it runs aground where the money is. And I already see this in DAOs happening, right? Where yes, there are certain aspects of the technical structure that facilitate decentralized governance. But as soon as people start getting spooked about regulatory compliance, as soon as they get spooked about who they can get funding from at a moment where they need some growth capital, and there are all these venture capital firms who have lots of money and communities of users who don't have lots of money, those issues of policy become very real, and they start to orchestrate design decisions. Again, with implicit feudalism, I think it's really important to see that, like, many of the people building democratic tool or building tools for online social spaces think of themselves as advocates of democracy. But the technical infrastructures and the policy infrastructures constrained their ability to implement democracy and democratic practices in digital space. Often kind of a death by 1,000 cuts. But in that story, I've seen reason to think that appealing to the standards building and culture building work of kind of voluntary and professional associations would be an incomplete strategy.
So Dick Hart's had his hand up for a while.
Hi, Dick. Good to see you.
Likewise. Good to see you, Doc. Good to see you, Nathan. Your comments around sort of the feudalism really resonate with me. You know, when you look at what are some of the online spaces that work today, like Wikipedia and Hacker News, you know, there's clearly a feudal list of like who's earned certain rights to be able to do certain things. You know, when Wikipedia just let anybody do anything, you know, people go crazy on some articles, and then the more senior people have to come in and calm it all down. I'm kind of wondering, does democracy even work? You know, you look at democracy in the US, and I would argue it's not really democracy today. And maybe we do need sort of more of a feudal structure where people, you know, level up to having more power than other people, so that, you know, it isn't mob rule, you know, people aren't getting swatted, you know, you don't have cancel culture.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the question of efficacy, we're not even there yet, because we don't have the capacity to even try the democratic thing, right? And I kind of want to defer that question to when we do. And I think there is some like long scale historical evidence that like enabling democratic like practices has certain competitive advantages over other types. But I don't feel like we have the evidence to know until we actually recognize that we haven't been able to try it. And what is interesting about some of the crypto stuff emerging now, again, not that I love crypto all the time, but that it is a space in which self-governance of sorts that are not available in most online spaces are available, and people are figuring this stuff out. And actually, they're remaking so many wheels that it makes clear how little we actually know about how to self-govern online. And so I come at it from a kind of place of ignorance. It's like, I don't even want to get into the question of efficacy until we have like the capacity to actually explore this space. That said, too, I think there is an importance in recognizing a stack, right? Or a kind of plurality. So, you know, an example that I've used in some research stuff is around the stack around open source software, where often you have diverse governance practices involved in a common system. So, you know, I run a Linux computer on, you know, and it's got like the benevolent dictatorship of the kernel, and then the slow and inefficient, but very effective in some ways, democracy of the Debian project on top of that, and then the corporate dictatorship of Ubuntu, and then this local small business in Colorado called System 76 that reshapes the Ubuntu stuff. So you have multiple governance regimes interacting with each other. And that kind of thing is a glimpse of the kind of future I imagine toward. Not we all figure out, you know, one democracy and we implement that everywhere and on all the time, which is kind of how the Tocquevillian democracy has gone, right? My Mother's Garden Club has the same bylaws probably as like a zillion labor unions and other kinds of civic associations of very different kinds. That most governments around the world that call themselves democracies, at least on paper, try to mimic each other in certain respects. I think with online spaces, we have an opportunity for much greater diversity of practices, much because of that exit, because of that replication. You know, innovations can spread more quickly and easily and cheaply. And so that to me is a really exciting opportunity at a moment where I totally agree, you know, our democratic governments have ossified and are kind of locked in a centuries-old system. The ability to innovate democratically in online space, I think, is actually vital to the survival of any kind of democratic governance anywhere. So, you know, I kind of start this argument thinking about like minute interactions in online space, but actually I think all of this leads to a bigger question of the future of like governance at some of the largest scales as well.
We're going to take Eric. Oh, there's one in here.
Well, I can
go for it.
Well, let me see if I can tease something out here that comes into focus sometimes when you're talking. It sounds sometimes like you think the opportunity at this moment with regards to DAOs is actually just like this emergent subcultural interest in governance as a practice, which is different from an assumption that there is something intrinsically interesting about the blockchain and blockchain technology. I mean, and unless your explicit purpose is to evade accountability from government, the notion of a distributed ledger seems neither necessary nor sufficient to engage in this kind of experimentation with new governance. And immutability seems in a lot of use cases to be more of a liability than a benefit, right? More of a bug than a feature. So I'm just trying to get a sense, like, are you able to articulate why immutability and distributed ledgers are inherently like necessary for a governance renaissance? Or is it really just that right now, somewhat incidentally, people are interested in governance, and that's an opportunity for us to talk about governance?
Yeah, so you know, to govern common pool resources, you have to have common pool resources, okay? And so you can get at that a few different directions. I mean, I have an essay, for instance, called, you know, Web3 is the opportunity we've had all along, right? I think there is a sense in which we could have done this before. Right. This is another opportunity where we could get at this. And it's probably not going to happen because of how trends happening in that ecosystem. But, okay, so why did distributed ledgers matter? Because, you know, the second you start a DAO, you have the opportunity to share ownership of it with whoever you assign tokens to, right? The second I start a federated social network on my lab server, or I start a Facebook group, we know who owns it. Because whoever owns the server owns it, and it's one owner, and it's singular. Now I could create a cooperative, right, that owns the server, and we can all be members of it. So we could do that in legal space, but actually, you know, like a cooperative I co-founded, social.coop, a social network. You know what? We can't. That's really hard because we have people all over the world. It would be a huge headache to get them all owners. We don't actually have enough money to do that anyway, and so that approach is tricky, plus all the reasons that cooperatives have a hard time in a system designed for capitalism. So I just think that the distributed ledger provides that opportunity to try again, to actually make collective ownership viable. And there are technical reasons why it opens that door in ways that servers don't. You know, you're not essentially doing everything descended from the Unix permission system, right? Which is in some respects at the root of, you know, the base layer of the implicitly feudal stack. The other thing is on immutability. I think immutability is kind of a ideological component of crypto culture. It was a big part of like the logic behind Bitcoin, but immutability is something that you could create a protocol that says, you know, we can vote to mutate transactions, to change transactions and reverse them. So immutability to me is more of a social construction, is more of a libertarian fantasy than it is a necessary product of the technology in any important sense. And it's one reason that, for instance, like to get into crypto politics, like the culture of Ethereum is really different from the culture of Bitcoin because it had this like founding moment of mutability. It was, I think, a really bad one. Like it was clearly very costly to carry out the reversal of this important hack in 2016, but it did instill in the culture the sense that actually the community is above the code, and so I've made proposals, for instance, about how we could build in mutability as actually a normal functioning of these systems, so that, for instance, like really harmful activities can be stopped on blockchains, right? And to me, that is more of a cultural decision to say we're going to do that than an absolute impossibility because of the technology. And again, I think people are avoiding the question of mutability in crypto because they kind of don't want the work of governing it. But I think we're going to have to deal with that if these systems are going to grow up and be adult and live in a world where people can really, really harm each other with them. We need to be able to say this contract's not going to run or this transaction is going to go backwards now.
There's so much going on the chat, but we have, we'll take Eric next, but Rashid's been active back there, and we kind of, we need to get to him too, because there's a lot of interaction about this. So go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, hi, thanks for doing this. It's a really fascinating conversation. I'm with a group called JournoDAO, and we're kind of exploring and experimenting with decentralization and how it might benefit journalism, which actually I think immutability is one feature that's very fascinating and could have really interesting utility for that. But I'm just curious, since you're in media studies, Nathan, and also I've followed you for quite a while, Doc, if you have any thoughts on how these tools could benefit specifically journalists and in a media context, or if you're aware of any particularly interesting experiments in that direction.
Yeah, well, I'm really interested in it. And I've been following this stuff for years. One project that I'm sure you're aware of is called Civil, that no longer exists, but actually I think had some really interesting lessons for governance. My students and I have been building this tool lately called, or it's like a wiki called Crypto Wake, and we've just started seeding these. The idea is like to do an Irish wake on dead crypto projects. Like the things that we remember that like have really interesting lessons that maybe we should try to keep in mind. And Civil was an attempt in like 2018, largely 2017, to build a kind of blockchain for crypto. And a few things that I think it did really well. One was just like give money to local journalism. So we have an amazing statewide news source called the Colorado Sun that cares nothing about crypto, took all its money in dollars, was totally not into the crypto mission, but because they got a bunch of money through the Civil project, they were able to start and now have like really, really shored up our local journalism ecosystem. So it kind of reaffirmed just that basic lesson of like, journalism needs more money to fall from the sky, right? And then really good things can happen. But another thing that Civil did that I thought was really cool was, and that I keep thinking about and using, is that they had this structure in which it was a blockchain-based like registry of who was on the Civil network. But the ultimate deciders of it were kind of a Supreme Court of, established older journalists. And so it was a really interesting example of how to design crypto economic systems built around, cryptography and economic incentives, but where, it's not economics all the way down, where at the end of the line, it's a group of like values motivated humans making decisions, and the crypto economics is designed to make that decision-making process more efficient. And that's an example to me of something I'd like to see more in the design of blockchain systems is ensuring that the economics is serving human values and human needs, not, we are all becoming enslaved to our blockchain-based greed, right? And so I think that, if you're building something around journalism with these systems, there's a real danger of what those economic incentives can do. And Civil bears some lessons about how to design economic systems with values at the end of the line.
I want to say, I don't know if Tom Stites wants to talk at all, but
yeah, Tom's been working on this problem.
Tom's been on this case for a long time, and Eric, I don't know, Tom may have an answer for you as well.
Should we go to Rashid?
Yeah, but let's go to Rashid.
Hi, and thanks for your talk and for giving me the chance to ask a question. I wanted to ask you, Nathan, if you've seen any great places for those that might be on the line who are interested in the entrepreneurial approach to implementing some of the different ideas that we're talking about, and what might be some of the core resources for them. As you mentioned, the legal layer, the capital layer, there's all of these different systems at play that are either barriers or conducive towards the entrepreneurial endeavors behind some of these great projects, spouting wonderful communal values, etc. But as you've experienced yourself and you've seen others, the real systems at play in their geographies are either letting those businesses flourish or fail. Could you talk a bit more about some sites where people can look for resources in those areas?
Yeah, thank you. Good to hear from you, Rashid. So I mentioned earlier the Meta Governance Project. It was started by largely academics, but we are really trying to build a community of practice. And so for people who are interested in exploring governance design in online space, that's what MetaGov is all about. And we're very, we're trying to cultivate more of a community space that enables people bringing experiments, trying to build new projects to find each other and work together and learn from each other. So I hope that is a useful resource. You can look at metagov.org and we can get you into the Slack space that we use and that sort of thing. Another network that I'm also involved in is called Zebras Unite. It's a cooperative of startup founders and investors and allies who are trying to develop more cooperative structures. It too is kind of a community of practice above all and a place to find each other. So I hope that's useful. There's also the platform cooperativism consortium and those sorts of things for cooperatives specifically. An accelerator co-founded called Start.coop that for early stage cooperatives, if that's of interest. But there's a bunch of stuff out there, but really not nearly enough. And the thing that just hits me over the head all the time when I'm working with founders and entrepreneurs is like, my goodness, I wish this were easier for you. And I'm sorry that history sucks, And a big part of it was, when policies were made for shared ownership, they were largely constrained around sectors. You get shared ownership for credit unions, but not for investment banks. You get shared ownership for rural electric cooperatives, but they weren't thinking about solar gardens in the 1930s. So if you're trying to start a solar garden, sorry, you can't access this massive pool of federal financing. And the list goes on. And so I have lots of ideas about how to make sure that when we design policies, we do it in a way that does not reproduce those inhibitions.
Carolina's had her hand up for a long time. It's been active.
No problem. No, this is perfect. And actually, you brought the discussion back to the issue I wanted to bring and ask you about, right? We were also talking in the chat about design and interoperability issues and democracy, right? And you were saying, it maybe lots of activities come and initiatives are created and things like that. But when I think about a systemic approach and some purposeful design and even developing policies, right? And if none of those, stick, right? So you don't create competition with some of the big players, and then you create extremely fragmented community which projects don't have any legal or technical interoperability, right? So how, in your opinion, and we work a lot with this challenge at the Data Sphere Initiative, and it's all around data governance issues, but how do you see dealing with that? Should we be thinking about some form of translation, right? Should we be thinking about some machine readable or metadata work that helps us translate things, right? If you think back historically in Creative Commons, right? I worked with CC very back in the beginning of the 2000s. So anyway, how are you thinking to address with that fragmentation?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's a deep one in the sense that it's sort of a problem now with online governance. But if my wildest dreams were to come true, we would, if your question didn't have a good answer, we would live in a nightmare, right? Of how many passwords do you have? And I hope you have really good password managers, right? And how many accounts do you have across the internet? What if you were co-owner of, a third of those? How would you possibly manage to be a decent, participant in all those systems? And clearly, to me at least, I think that's going to involve like a new question of, again, what we call meta governance. How do we live in a world in which we are, democratic subjects of multiple spaces simultaneously? And I think this kind of interaction is really essential to that. You're already seeing that in crypto land to some degree, where there actually is a concept of meta governance, which is like when a DAO owns, is voting in multiple DAOs. And so you're voting in one DAO, and then it kind of ricochets across the system, and you're actually interacting with multiple networks. And that's possible because these systems have this underlying blockchain layer. Their tokens are interoperable because of a standard. And so actually, some aspects of the question you asked, again, exist there, not necessarily the way we would like, but we see a glimpse. And so in the meta governance project, we've been trying to build on that by, again, working with DAO tooling organizations to build standards around governance, so that their basic governance primitives like proposals and a vote or a different kind of practice is something that other DAOs can see, so that if there is a shared standard, there's a shared data model, interoperability applications just become a lot easier. So that's a major priority for us. And the reason why that's a priority is we developed this framework at the beginning of the MetaGov work that we call modular politics. And in that, we have 4 principles at the beginning. Modularity, so structures can move and be combined with each other. A kind of composability, portability, so they can move from one application to another. So a voting structure designed for a garden club can move to an email list. And then interoperability is there as well. And then expressivity, which is, it can express lots of different kinds of things. But that interoperability, we kind of defined there early on as, this is going to be important if we're serious about doing governance on networks. So I guess the shortest answer I would make to that is we need standards. And that is a really important arena for those of us who are working in non-commercial spaces to help lead the work of standards development, of collaboration, of building really rad open standards that the commercial folks want to adopt and that make their jobs easier. And so I think there's a real need to build up commons really intentionally around the standards for how we do online governance.
Caroline, any more on that? Because I've been writing there.
It's just like, I keep thinking about this and some of all the translation work that needs to be done among those standards. I'm looking into like over 40 principles on data governance that different communities put forward. And it's very sad to see that some international collaborations still take like 3 to 5 years to negotiate a contract because of the lack of these standards and understanding and modularities, right? But I'm gonna stop. And I know Bertrand, he is my co-founder in the data.
Thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Bertrand.
Yeah, thank you. Two quick comments. Fascinating discussions. One, you started at the very early stage of the comments mentioning different voting mechanisms. And the more we talk about voting, the more I'm worried about what are the alternatives to the majority voting and those things. And the second comment I put in the chat is you alluded at one point to a very interesting concept of sort of nested layers of regulation or governance. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges is that this is a concept that is very familiar in traditional government, which is subsidiarity. The problem with adapting this to online communities, I feel, is that the nested communities in governments are hierarchical, they are pyramidal, whereas in the online communities that we want to govern, it's more something like a hypergraph, where basically we belong to many communities that may have different overlapping regulations or rules. how to adapt to this different environment, which is not a pyramidal system, but a more mesh network, and how to
Well, so I just have a paper with Amy Hasanoff at University of Denver, building on work that Seth Fry did along with other MetaGov colleagues, that distinguishes between federal subsidiarity and federalist subsidiarity and polycentric subsidiarity, an attempt to recognize that subsidiarity can exist in both of those forms, and that we need to theorize them more intentionally. I mean, for instance, like what are called federated networks in social media are actually polycentric, and they're not federated, but they are. It is useful to talk about them in terms of subsidiarity, and to recognize that there are different emergent properties in those different approaches. So yes, I think that distinction you made is close to my heart, and something that I think is really useful. Also, what you said about voting is something very close to my heart. I'm kind of at heart a anti-representarian. I don't know if that's a word, but I'm very interested in how can we create more democratic spaces. And so I agree that the word voting kind of, sends a chill down my spine. But it is interesting, it is, in some respects, it's not, maybe we need a different word for some of these practices, because some of the things that are going on that I'm referring to as new voting systems, might be better described as staking, setting intentions. In many cases, these votes are actually direct allocations of resources. So like when we talk about quadratic funding on a platform like Gitcoin, the vote occurs, through actually giving money, and then there's a rule set for how that money gets amplified by more money. So I think, above all, the goal for me in the logic of modular politics, in the kind of hope about alternatives to implicit feudalism, is to unleash all the possibilities that we can't really do right now, because our governments are very conservative in terms of their willingness to adopt new mechanisms, because it serves the water and there's a lot at stake. It's understandable. But then also our online spaces are very rigid for technical and legal reasons. And so to me, the goal here is how can we unleash the possibilities in which we can start getting much, much more creative about how we make decisions. And you certainly see in crypto land where, again, not perfect, but where this innovation is happening more than in other spaces, that there is a lot of non-voting innovation happening there. A lot of it started with the idea that, we're going to have referendums for everything. And then, you go through a season and you realize that is tiring and non-functional and disastrous. And so we start creating structures where people are permissioned to do things, without asking for a vote. You start moving into more like rational and humane structures. So, I think if we had that space to experiment, there would be really good answers to your question.
Okay, Johannes, I'm told this is our last one.
For the recording.
For the recording. So we'll continue past the recording, but the recording is going to end after this. The chat we could keep, by the way. I can't, because anybody can save that as well.
So, yes, Nathan, I want to connect to something that you just said about what a nightmare would be, or something like that, if we had to participate in governance in like hundreds of places. And I want to turn this around, and I want to say, what about if we had pervasive, explicit governance structures everywhere? And that might not be hundreds; that might actually be more than that. For example, if I were to start a chat with you on Signal, we would have an explicit governance structure for this chat. That is not particularly interesting, it's only two of us, but if we add a third and a fourth person, then all of a sudden there's a question of, what are the rules here? And I think what would be nice if we have pervasive governments everywhere. That's my first point. And the second, and explicit, so that it could just be templates in many cases, and it never gets changed, but we know what the rules are. And secondly, I think it is not actually necessary to participate in all of these places in a way that we vote or really are active participants in governance. I think there's a quote from Popper, if I remember this right, who said that the essence of all of this was to vote to be able to throw the bums out. And I think that would be something that I would be satisfied with in many cases, rather than having a vote to say what happens, just to pull the people out that very clearly, misbehave or do the wrong thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think about this a lot because I am a member of a lot of cooperatives, and just by dint of what I've been doing for the last years, and like my credit union, like I can't look at a spreadsheet for 5 minutes without my eyes burning out. So like, I really just I have no interest in participating in my credit union's governance, but I am glad that ultimately on paper, it's accountable to me, and that, the people who are in charge have a kind of fiduciary responsibility to me. That's cool. On the other hand, I'm part of a small investment cooperative where we invest in local cooperative businesses. And that I really do want to participate in, not because I want to look at spreadsheets, but because part of that involves like developing relationships, and that's cool. So I think, we're going to develop these, I think about this in terms of the language of jurisdictions. We have the opportunity to develop many jurisdictions in our lives, and some of those are ones that, and we'll have different relationships to each of those. And some of them, we probably just don't want to think about that much, and that's cool, because somebody else will. But the question for me is always, how do you get the lines of accountability right? On most days that my credit union looks just like the Wells Fargo across the street. But what really matters is that at the end of the day, they're not like making up accounts to defraud Wall Street. They're just like, there's a basic incentive difference, in that little change matters. On your other point about
governance being everywhere, even in every single chat.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. And we have some experiments in MetaGov around like agreement engines to create agreement. I have this tool called CommunityRule. It gives you templates to I love that idea that you would just like start a chat, quickly pick a template, and there we go, you're ready to go. If those things are ready at hand, it becomes a lot easier to structure, to bring in those structures. And a lot of social networks are doing that by encouraging more rulemaking, still very top down. But I just think it's really valuable to end on a point that you made there. And it helps me acknowledge the fact that a lot of my thinking around this stuff is informed by feminist thought. And one example of that is that famous essay on the tyranny of structurelessness by Joe Freeman, pointing out in these feminist rap groups of the early 1970s, the dangers of unstructured space. And I think we have a lot of tyrannies of structurelessness. There's a reason that essay keeps coming back. I tried to reach out to Joe Freeman and said, can I interview you about tech? And she's like, why do people keep asking me about tech? I don't know anything about tech stuff, but what she said about about those activist groups, and that I've seen in activist groups, is just keeps repeating itself. And when we do not intentionally structure spaces, they will be structured for us. And that to me is an incredible calling, to say, let's do this intentionally, instead of simply deferring to existing external power structures, formal or informal. So thank you for that.
Well, Paul is up next.
David.
No? Oh, no,
So
okay.
I want to take 2 seconds for everyone to think today. Of course, as always, we stay on a little bit longer for the questions that remain. And again, we do save these questions as well that have come up in the chat. So if there are any questions that have been missed or whatever, everyone has an opportunity to respond to them as well. Because of course, we creepily have your email addresses because you signed up for this. So with that, if we can give a hand to both, what a wonderful salon series, and thank you for this. And Paul, please do stay because we would love to answer the question, but thank you all.